She was sitting on the front steps of my son's rental house when I pulled up. My daughter-in-law. Her arms were crossed, her jaw was tight, and she had that look on her face. The one she always got when she'd already decided how something was going to go. I almost drove past. I wish I could say, I stopped because I'm a good person. The truth is, I stopped because my son had called me 40 minutes earlier, and his voice sounded like it did when he was 9 years old, and fell off his bike and didn't want to cry in front of the neighborhood kids. That particular strain in a grown man's voice, I've never been able to drive past that. She changed the locks, he had said. Just that. No explanation. No lead up. She changed the locks and she's saying the house is hers now. I have Maggie. I don't know what to do. Maggie is 6. She has her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, which means she has mine, and I will not apologize for that. I told him to stay exactly where he was. I told him not to sign anything, not to argue, not to raise his voice. Then I hung up and I put on my shoes and I drove the 22 minutes to that house on Clover Street without speeding once, because I needed to think clearly, and I cannot think clearly when I'm driving fast. My daughter-in-law, I'll call her by what she was, my son's wife, was still on the steps when I got out of the car. My son was standing on the sidewalk. Maggie was sitting on top of a laundry basket with a stuffed elephant in her lap, watching a ladybug on the pavement with the complete concentration of a child who has learned that the safest thing to do when adults are upset is to become very interested in something small. I looked at that basket, one laundry basket, a backpack. That was everything they had managed to take out. I looked at my son. He was 41 years old, and he looked like he didn't know what country he was in. "Grandma," Maggie said, without looking up from the ladybug. "Hey, Bug," I said, "don't let her get away." I turned to my son's wife then. I have known this woman for 9 years. I was in the hospital when Maggie was born. I have sat across from her at Thanksgiving 11 times. I have never once disliked her, which made what she was doing that afternoon harder to understand and harder to forgive. "Ruth Ann," I said. "That's her name. Ruth Ann. I think you and I should talk." She said she had nothing to say to me. She said the house was in her name. She said my son could come back for the rest of his things on Saturday between 10 and noon, and that she'd be having her brother present during that time. She said all of this without looking at me. I spent 31 years as a benefits administrator at a regional insurance company. I started as a file clerk when I was 24, and I worked my way up to director of human resources by the time I was 53. I have sat across from people in the worst moments of their professional lives. People being let go. People fighting terminations. People who had done something wrong and knew it and were waiting to see if I knew it too. I have learned, in that time, that the people who talk the most in those situations are usually the ones who are the most afraid. Ruth Ann talked for about 4 minutes straight without taking a breath. When she finished, I said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." She blinked. "I'm going to take my son and my granddaughter to get something to eat," I said. "We'll be back for the rest of his things tonight. Not Saturday. Tonight." She started to say something about her brother. I said, "You don't need your brother for that. He lives an hour away. We'll be here at 7. Then I picked up Maggie's backpack, put it over my shoulder, and told my son to grab the laundry basket and put it in my trunk. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was small, and I told him something was going to be okay. That particular look, trusting and uncertain at the same time, like he wanted to believe me but wasn't quite ready to. "Get in the car," I said. "I'll explain everything. I need to go back a little." Because this didn't start on that afternoon on Clover Street. It started about 8 months earlier, at my kitchen table, when my son came to me with a problem I didn't fully understand at the time. He and Ruth Ann had been having trouble. I knew that. I'm not a woman who pretends not to see things, and I had seen the careful silence between them at Christmas, the way she'd excused herself from the table twice during dinner, the way he'd watched the door every time she did. Something had shifted. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place to ask. What he came to tell me was this. 3 years earlier, when they'd first moved to that area, they hadn't been able to afford a house on their own. Ruth Ann's family had helped. Her mother, specifically, a woman I'll call by her role, which is my son's mother-in-law, had offered to put the down payment on a house if they could handle the mortgage. $45,000. It seemed generous. It was presented as a gift. My son had a different understanding than what was written down. What was written down, what he showed me finally that night at my kitchen table, was a document that said the house was in his mother-in-law's name, with a right of occupancy granted to Ruth Ann and her spouse for as long as the marriage remained intact. That last clause is what he hadn't read carefully enough when he was 32 years old and excited to have a home and trusted the people around him. She helped us move in, he said. She bought us a housewarming gift. She came to Maggie's birthday parties. I know she did. I looked at the document for a long time. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. I am not a lawyer, and nothing about what happened next should be taken as legal advice. But I have spent 3 decades reading contracts and employment agreements and benefit plan documents, and I know how to find the sentence that matters. I know where the weight usually sits in a paragraph. The weight in that paragraph sat on the words, as long as the marriage remains intact. Are you and Ruth Ann getting divorced? I asked. He said he didn't know yet. He said they were trying. I said, has her mother said anything to you about the house? He said no, not directly. But Ruth Ann had mentioned once in a fight that her mother had told her she was protected. She had used that word specifically, protected. I asked him if he had kept records of the mortgage payments. He had his bank statements, 3 years of them, showing the automatic transfers every month. I asked if he had kept any documentation of repairs or improvements he had paid for out of pocket. He had some of that too. Not all of it, but some. I told him to find everything he had, every receipt, every bank statement, every email. He asked me what I thought was going to happen. I told him I didn't know yet, but I told him to be prepared, not to panic. Panic doesn't help you find what you need. It just makes the room feel smaller. He nodded, but I don't think he believed me. You never believe that until afterward. The dinner that night was at a diner 2 miles from Clover Street. Maggie ate a grilled cheese and most of my French fries and told us extensively about a movie she'd seen at school about ocean animals. She described in considerable detail the eating habits of the mantis shrimp. My son ate about 6 bites of his burger and stared at the table. When Maggie went to the bathroom with me, she held my hand very tightly. She didn't say anything. She just held on, and I held back, and that was its own kind of conversation. At the table, after she had fallen mostly asleep against my son's arm, I told him what I thought we could do. The house was in his mother-in-law's name. That much was clear. But my son had paid 37 months of mortgage payments. He had receipts for a new water heater, for bathroom tile, for a fence he'd built in the backyard. He had, somewhere in his email, a message from his mother-in-law thanking him for taking such good care of her investment. Her words. Her investment. That phrase was going to be important. I told him he needed a lawyer, a real one, not my reading of documents at a kitchen table. I told him that the equity argument might not hold perfectly, but that the pattern of payments and improvements, combined with the right of occupancy clause and the manner in which it had been terminated, was going to make someone very uncomfortable in a deposition. He asked me how I knew any of this. I said, because I have spent 30 years watching people try to protect things they don't actually own on paper. And I have watched the other side too. The people who think a piece of paper makes them untouchable. It usually doesn't. What I didn't say, because the time for saying it hadn't come yet, was that I had already made a phone call that afternoon from the diner parking lot while Maggie was washing her hands. I had called a woman I used to work with. She's in HR consulting now, but her husband is a family law attorney, and they've been married for 26 years, and I've known them both long enough to call without apologizing for the hour. Her husband called me back inside 12 minutes. His name is not important. What's important is that he was calm. He was specific, and within the first 3 minutes of the conversation, he said the phrase, constructive displacement. I wrote it down on a napkin. We went back to Clover Street at 7, like I had said we would, my son and I, with Maggie asleep in the back seat. Ruth Ann opened the door before we knocked. She'd clearly been watching for us. I asked her, politely, if we could take the rest of my son's personal belongings. His clothes, his tools from the garage, Maggie's bedroom furniture and toys. She said we could take everything that was his. She said the furniture was shared property, and she'd need to discuss that with her lawyer. I said, of course. Take whatever time you need. She looked at me like she was trying to figure out what I was doing. I wasn't doing anything right at that moment. I was carrying boxes. I was handing my son the right things when he got flustered about what to take. I was making sure Maggie's stuffed animals were wrapped carefully in a towel so they didn't get dusty. When we were leaving, Ruth Ann said to me, not unkindly, and I want to be fair about this because she said it in a way that sounded like she'd been rehearsing it. I'm sorry it went this way, but the house was always going to come back to my family. I stopped at the door. I turned around. I know, I said. That's actually what we're counting on. I don't know if she understood what I meant. I didn't wait to find out. The next 3 months were not cinematic. I want to be honest about that. There was no single dramatic moment, no confrontation in a parking lot, no tearful scene. There was paperwork, there were emails, there were phone calls that lasted 45 minutes and covered things like unjust enrichment doctrine and the distinction between a gift and the loan with expectations attached. The attorney, my friend's husband, had a colleague who took the case on a modified retainer after reviewing the documents. She was efficient and thorough, and the kind of person who uses very few words, and each of the words she uses is doing a lot of work. What she found, when she looked at everything carefully, was this. The original $45,000 had been described in 2 separate emails from Ruth Ann's mother to my son as a loan, not a gift. A loan. The word loan appeared in both messages. The agreement itself used different language, but the emails existed, and emails have dates, and dates are inconvenient things to argue with. Additionally, my son had paid 37 months of mortgage payments out of his own salary, not from a joint account, from his personal checking account. The house had increased in value. The water heater, the bathroom tile, the fence, all of it documented. He had not been a tenant. He had been, in every practical sense, a co-investor in a property that he had just been locked out of. The right of occupancy clause, the attorney explained, could be challenged on multiple grounds. Terminating occupancy without legal notice, without a court order, by simply changing the locks, that was not how this worked. That was not how any of this worked. Ruth Ann's mother hired a lawyer 3 days after receiving the first letter. He was not, from what I understand, particularly well prepared for what she brought with her. My son stayed with me during those months. Maggie had her own room, the one that used to be my son's when he was in high school, which I had converted to a guest room years ago, but which still had, in the closet, a box of his old baseball cards and a trophy from a spelling bee he'd won in 6th grade. Maggie found both of these things within 48 hours of moving in. She carried the trophy around the house for 2 days. I let her. There were hard nights. I will not pretend there weren't. My son is not someone who asks for help easily. He got that from his father, who passed 8 years ago, and from me, if I'm being honest, because I didn't exactly model it either. There were nights he sat at the kitchen table after Maggie was in bed and just stared at his coffee, and I didn't know what to say, and so I didn't say anything. And we sat there together in the quiet, and sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't, and there was nothing to be done about that. I made a lot of soup during those months. I don't know why. I'm not a particularly sentimental cook, but I made soup almost every Sunday, different kinds, whatever I had, and we ate it, the 3 of us, and Maggie always wanted crackers, more crackers than anyone could reasonably need, and my son always let her have them. And those Sunday evenings were something I will carry for the rest of my life. The settlement came in the 9th week. I wasn't in the room for the final negotiation. That's not how these things work. It's not a movie. But the attorney called me afterward because my son had asked her to. The substance of it, the $45,000 loan was formally acknowledged and the terms renegotiated as part of the overall property settlement. My son's equity contribution, calculated from mortgage payments and documented improvements, was recognized. The right of occupancy termination was found to have been improper. There was a monetary settlement. My son will not be homeless. Maggie will have stability. I will not share the specific number because that's his to share or not share, and he hasn't, and I respect that. What I will say is that when the attorney finished telling me, she paused and then she said, "Your son was lucky to have someone who read the documents." I said, "He read them too. He just read them when he was 32 and in love and didn't think he needed to be careful." She said, "Most people don't at 32. I said, "I know. That's the whole problem." There is one more thing I want to say, and it's the thing I've been circling around since I started telling this story. When I drove to Clover Street that afternoon, when I saw my son standing on the sidewalk with a laundry basket and his daughter watching a ladybug, I was not calm because I am strong. I have had people say that to me since when I've mentioned this story, and I appreciate the sentiment, but it's not quite right. I was calm because I was afraid. I was afraid of what happened if I came in hot, if I said the wrong thing to Ruth Ann on those steps, if I escalated instead of de-escalated, if I made her feel cornered and she did something that would take weeks to undo. I have watched people make that mistake. In conference rooms, in HR disputes, in performance reviews, and I have seen what it costs. I have seen people win the argument and lose everything else. Staying calm was not a choice I made out of strength. It was a choice I made out of calculation. I knew that the most dangerous thing I could do in that moment was show her how angry I was. I was furious. I want to be clear about that. I stood on that sidewalk and I looked at my son and I looked at Maggie with her stuffed elephant, and I felt something that had no room for itself in my chest, and I had to put it somewhere that wasn't my face and wasn't my voice. And so I put it in my feet and I walked toward the car and I said, "Get in." That's not wisdom. That's just knowing which tool to use when. Maggie is back in her own room now, which is to say she's in a new apartment my son rented, which she has decorated very specifically with drawings of ocean animals and a glow-in-the-dark solar system on her ceiling that took us both 2 hours to put up correctly and probably 3 weeks off my knees. She calls me every Sunday. She always asks about the soup. I make it every week, even now. Even when I'm eating alone. I don't know when that became a habit. Probably somewhere around week 3, when I realized that the Sunday soup was one of the few things that week I had control over. The thing about being 63 years old and watching your family go through something like this is that you have enough history to know it doesn't last forever, and enough love to make the waiting unbearable anyway. You know the shape of recovery because you've seen it before, in yourself, in people you've loved, in the particular way humans put things back together when they have to. You know it happens, and knowing it happens does not make the in-between any shorter. But you show up, you pick up the backpack, you drive the 22 minutes without speeding, you make the soup. That's all it ever is, really. You find what you can do, and you do it, and eventually the doing adds up to something. And one day your granddaughter calls you from her new room and tells you about the mantis shrimp and asks if you're making soup this Sunday. And you say yes, and she says good, and the weight in your chest that you've been carrying since the afternoon on Clover Street shifts, not gone, but different, lighter somehow, and more possible to hold. "Grandma," she said last Sunday. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing. "Yeah, Bug," I said. "I knew you'd fix it. I didn't fix it. I want to be honest about that too. I read some documents, I made some phone calls, I showed up when I was called. I stayed calm when it would have been easier not to. That's what I did, whether that counts as fixing something or just refusing to let it stay broken. I'm not sure there's a difference when you're the one standing on the sidewalk. Go do your homework," I told her. She laughed. She hung up. I went and started the soup. I've been asked, since this happened, whether I think Ruth Ann is a bad person. People want a clean answer to that. They want me to say yes, she is, because it makes the story tidier. A villain and a victim and a rescuer. I understand the appeal of that. But I've lived long enough to know that most situations that look like villainy are actually just people making a series of small, self-interested decisions until one day the decisions add up to something they can't take back. Ruth Ann didn't wake up one morning and decide to hurt my son. She made choices. She and her mother both did, that prioritized their security over his, and they made those choices over and over again until the day they changed the locks and called it finished. What I keep coming back to is the document, the one my son didn't read carefully enough at 32. And I don't say that to blame him. I say it because it's the truest thing about this whole situation. Every consequence that followed, every hard month, every night he sat at my kitchen table staring at his coffee, it all traced back to a single paragraph that nobody read closely enough at the time it mattered. That's how most of the damage in a life happens, in my experience. Not in explosions. In the things we skim over when we're happy and trusting and in a hurry to get to the good part. What saved him? What actually saved him wasn't me. I want to be clear about that. What saved him was the fact that he had been honest. He had paid what he owed every single month. He had kept records without knowing he'd need them. He had done the right thing for 3 years inside a situation that was, it turned out, not what he thought it was. And when everything came apart, all of that quiet honesty became evidence. It became the thing that couldn't be argued with. That's the part I think about when people ask me what the lesson is. The lesson isn't hire a lawyer, though yes, hire a lawyer. The lesson isn't read your contracts, though yes, for the love of everything, read your contracts. The lesson is that integrity is not just a moral position, it is a practical one. The way you conduct yourself in ordinary time, when nothing is at stake and nobody is watching, is exactly what determines what you have available to you when everything is. Maggie didn't know any of that, of course. She was 6. She watched a ladybug on the pavement while her parents' marriage ended and her grandmother drove 22 minutes without speeding. She carried a spelling bee trophy around the house for 2 days and asked for more crackers than any reasonable person could justify, and called me every Sunday to talk about ocean animals. Children have a way of insisting that life continue. I needed that. Those months. More than I knew. What I want to say, if you're watching this and you're in the middle of something that feels impossible, the middle is the worst part. I know that's not a comfort exactly, but it's true. The middle is where everything feels permanent and nothing feels solvable, and you can't yet see the shape of what comes next. That's not weakness, that's just where you are. The question is only what you do while you're there. You find the documents, you make the calls, you pick up the backpack, you drive the 22 minutes, you make the soup on Sunday even when you're eating alone. That's all it takes, really. Not strength, not strategy, just deciding every day to do the next thing that's in front of you, with as much honesty and as much steadiness as you can manage, and trusting that the doing adds up. It does. I've seen it. I've lived it. It adds up.